The holding cell smells like wet concrete and old fear. Bumpy Johnson sits with his back against the brick wall, hands resting on his knees, breathing slow and steady while three detectives stand outside the bars, watching him like he's supposed to crack. This is arrest number 28. Maybe 29. He's stopped counting. One of them, a young cop with red hair and a clipboard, leans forward. "You know how this goes, Bumpy. Give us names. Give us locations. Walk out of here tonight." Bumpy doesn't look up. He doesn't blink. He just sits there, still as stone, like a man who's learned that silence is the only language worth speaking when the whole world's trying to make you talk. "We got witnesses." The detective continues. "We got evidence. We got enough to put you away for 10 years, but you help us. And maybe, just maybe, you see your family by Christmas." The other two detectives shift their weight. They've heard this pitch before. They know it doesn't work on Bumpy Johnson, but they keep trying anyway, because what else can they do? The man's been arrested more times than some officers have been on duty, and not once, not a single time, has he given them anything. Outside, Harlem is waking up. The sun hasn't broken over the tenements yet, but the streets are already moving. Vendors setting up, mothers walking kids to school, old men sitting on stoops, waiting for the day to prove itself worth living. This is 1952, and the neighborhood is caught between two worlds, the one it's trying to become and the one it can't escape. Bumpy finally lifts his head. His eyes are calm, tired but calm. "You done?" he asks, voice low and even. The red-headed cop exhales, frustrated. He glances at his partners, then back at Bumpy. "You think this makes you tough?" Sitting there like some kind of martyr? "I think," Bumpy says quietly, "you're wasting your time." They leave him alone after that. The iron door clangs shut, and the echo rolls down the hallway, swallowed by the building's indifference. Bumpy closes his eyes and leans his head back against the wall. His wife's face floats behind his eyelids, May, standing in their kitchen that morning, hands wrapped around a coffee cup, not saying anything because there's nothing left to say. She knows where this road goes. She's known for years. But she also knows something the cops don't. She knows the rule. The thing about Bumpy Johnson is that most people only see half the picture. They see the arrests, the headlines, the whispers that follow him through the streets like shadows. They see a man who's built a life in the margins, who's made choices that put him on the wrong side of the law and kept him there. And they assume that means he has no code. No line he won't cross. No principle worth protecting. They're wrong. Bumpy grew up in South Carolina, where the rules were written by men who didn't consider him human. He learned early that survival meant understanding power, who had it, how they used it, and what happened to people who got in the way. When he moved to Harlem as a teenager, he brought that understanding with him. He saw the neighborhood for what it was, a place where people were trying to live with dignity in a system designed to strip it away. And he made a choice, not a loud one, not a speech or a declaration, just a quiet decision about the kind of man he would be in a world that had already decided what he was. He would never, never put the neighborhood at risk to save himself. It sounds simple, maybe even obvious. But simplicity has weight when you're sitting in a jail cell for the 29th time, staring at a decade behind bars, and all you have to do is say a few names, point a few fingers, trade a little information for a little freedom. Bumpy never does. 3 days pass. The cell stays cold. The detectives come and go, their tactics shifting from threats to bargains to something close to pleading. They bring in a senior officer, a man with gray at his temples and a voice that's learned to sound almost kind. "Look," the older cop says, sitting down on a metal chair outside the bars, "I get it. You have a reputation to protect. But we're not asking you to betray anyone who matters, just the guys on the edges, the ones who'd sell you out in a heartbeat if the tables were turned." Bumpy is staring at the floor, tracing a crack in the concrete with his eyes. He doesn't respond. "You've got a wife," the cop continues. "You've got people depending on you. You really want to spend the next 10 years in here while the world moves on without you?" For the first time in 3 days, Bumpy looks directly at him. "You got kids?" he asks. The cop blinks, caught off guard. "Yeah. 2. They proud of you?" The question hangs in the air, sharp and uncomfortable. The older cop shifts in his chair. "I like to think so." Bumpy nods slowly. "Then you understand." "Understand what?" "Why I can't do what you're asking." The cop frowns, frustrated but not angry. "You think the people in Harlem are proud of you? You think they see you as some kind of hero?" "No," Bumpy says quietly. "But they trust me. And that's worth more." The older detective stands, shaking his head. He's about to walk away when Bumpy speaks again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You ever been in a place where the law doesn't protect you? Where the people who are supposed to keep you safe are the ones you gotta fear the most?" The cop stops, doesn't turn around, just listens. In Harlem, Bumpy continues, we don't get to call 911 and expect help. We don't get to trust that the system's gonna do right by us. So we trust each other. And if I break that, if I give you names to save my own skin, then what am I? Just another man who puts himself first when it matters most. The detective turns, looking back at Bumpy through the bars. For a moment, something passes between them. Not agreement, not understanding, exactly. But a recognition, a glimpse of the weight Bumpy carries every day. The mathematics of survival in a world that never added up. "You're gonna regret this," the cop says. But there's no heat in it, just resignation. Bumpy shakes his head. "I've regretted a lot of things in my life. This won't be one of them." The charges stick. Bumpy is sentenced to 5 years. When the judge reads the verdict, he doesn't flinch, doesn't protest, doesn't beg. He just stands there, hands folded in front of him, accepting the consequence like a man who knew it was coming and chose it anyway. In the gallery, Mamie sits with her hands in her lap, her face still. She's not crying. She cried years ago, when she first understood what loving Bumpy Johnson would mean. Now she's just watching, memorizing the shape of his shoulders, the way he holds his head, the quiet dignity he wears like armor. When they lead him away, he catches her eye for just a second. No words, no gesture, just a look that says everything they've already said to each other 1,000 times. "I'm sorry. I know. I love you. I know that too." The first year inside is the hardest. Not because of the conditions. Bumpy's been in worse places. Not because of the isolation. He spent most of his life learning how to be alone in a crowd. It's hard because the world outside keeps turning, and he can't be part of it. Mame visits when she can, bringing news from the neighborhood, careful updates that let him know how people are doing, without saying too much. She tells him about the new store on 145th Street, the kid who got a scholarship to college, the family who lost their father, and how the community came together to help. She doesn't tell him about the men who tried to move in on his territory, about the violence that flared up when power shifted, about the people who asked where Bumpy was, wondering if he'd forgotten about them. But Bumpy knows. He can read between the lines of her careful words. He knows what his absence costs. And still, when the warden calls him into the office 18 months into his sentence and offers him a deal, early release in exchange for cooperation, Bumpy says no. "You're a fool," the warden says, lighting a cigarette and leaning back in his chair. "You know that?" "Maybe," Bumpy replies. "You could be home in 6 months. Back with your wife. Back to your life. At what price?" The warden laughs. A dry sound with no humor in it. "Price? Johnson. You're already paying. Every day you spend in here is a day you're not out there. What difference does it make if you give them a few names? These guys you're protecting, you think they'd do the same for you?" Bumpy meets his eyes. "Doesn't matter if they would. Matters what I do." The warden stubs out his cigarette, shaking his head. "You're either the most principled man I've ever met or the most stubborn. I can't figure out which." "Both," Bumpy says simply. He serves the full sentence. 5 years, 60 months, 1,800 days of watching the sun rise and set through bars, of eating meals at the same table, of sleeping on a cot that's too short and too hard, of measuring time in visits from Mame and letters that arrive less frequently as the years stretch on. But something happens during those 5 years. Something the detectives and the warden and the prosecutors never anticipated. Bumpy becomes a legend. Not because of what he did on the outside, not because of his reputation, or his power, or his influence, but because of what he didn't do on the inside. Word spreads in Harlem, in the prisons, in the networks of people who live in the margins, that Bumpy Johnson spent 5 years behind bars and never once gave up a name. Never traded information for freedom. Never broke the code. And in a world where betrayal is common, where desperation makes people compromise their principles, where survival often means choosing yourself over everyone else, that kind of loyalty becomes something rare, something valuable, something worth respecting. When Bumpy walks out of prison in 1957, the neighborhood is different. The streets look the same, but the energy has shifted. There's a tension in the air. A sense that change is coming whether people are ready for it or not. The civil rights movement is building momentum. Young people are starting to ask questions their parents were afraid to speak out loud. The old rules are being challenged, and nobody knows what the new ones will look like. Bumpy stands on the corner of 145th and Lenox, breathing in the smell of Harlem, exhaust fumes and fried chicken and laundry detergent and possibility. Mame is beside him, her hand in his. Neither of them speaking because there's too much to say, and no words big enough to hold it. A kid walks by, maybe 16, with his friends. He glances at Bumpy, does a double take, then stops. "You're him," the kid says. Not a question, a statement. Bumpy looks at him, waiting. "You're Bumpy Johnson, the guy who didn't snitch." "That's right," Bumpy says quietly. The kid nods, something like awe in his eyes. "My dad talks about you, says you're the only one who kept his word when it cost him everything." Bumpy doesn't know how to respond to that. He's not a hero. He's just a man who made a choice and lived with it. But he can see what it means to this kid, standing here on a Harlem street, looking for something to believe in. "Your dad's exaggerating," Bumpy finally says. "But tell him I said hello." The kid grins and walks away with his friends, talking low and fast, glancing back like he just met somebody important. Mame squeezes Bumpy's hand. "You're gonna have to get used to that," she says softly. "To what?" "Being the story people tell." Bumpy shakes his head. "I'm not a story, I'm just—" "You're the man who kept his word," Mame interrupts gently. "In a world that gave you every reason not to. That means something, Bumpy, whether you want it to or not." They walk home slowly, through streets that remember him, past buildings that hold his history, under a sky that's seen every version of him there's ever been. And with every step, Bumpy feels the weight of what he protected. Not just his reputation, not just his pride, but the invisible thread that holds a community together when everything else is trying to tear it apart. Trust. That's all it ever was. That's all it ever needed to be. Over the next decade, Bumpy rebuilds. Not his empire. He's older now, more aware of the cost of that life. But his presence, his place. He becomes someone the neighborhood turns to when conflicts need resolving. When young men are making choices that'll define their lives. When families need help that the system won't provide. He never preaches, never lectures, just listens, offers what wisdom he can, and lives by the same rule that kept him silent in that jail cell all those years ago. Never put the community at risk to save yourself. The arrests keep coming. 30 in total, over the course of his life. Some stick, some don't. But each time they put him in handcuffs, each time they offer him a deal, each time they try to break him down, the answer is the same. No, not because he's trying to be a martyr. Not because he's chasing some romantic idea of loyalty. But because he understands something fundamental about power and survival that the system never will. When you're part of a community that the world has decided is disposable, trust is the only currency that matters. Break it, and you have nothing. Keep it, and you have everything. In 1968, Bumpy Johnson dies of a heart attack in a Harlem restaurant, surrounded by people who knew him, respected him, and understood what he represented. The funeral is massive. Thousands of people line the streets, not to mourn a criminal, but to honor a man who kept his word when it cost him everything. The newspapers write about his arrests, his connections, his life in the underworld. They list his crimes like they're defining him, like they're the whole story. But in Harlem, people tell a different story. They talk about the man who went to prison 5 times and never gave up a name, who protected the neighborhood even when it meant sacrificing his freedom, who proved that honor isn't about the law you follow, but the code you keep when nobody's watching. There's a moment at the funeral when Mame stands at the casket, her hand resting on the polished wood, and someone asks her what she'll remember most. She's quiet for a long time. Then she says, "He never broke." 30 arrests, and he never broke. Why? The person asks. What kept him strong? Mame looks out at the crowd, at the faces of people Bumpy protected, without them ever knowing, at the neighborhood he loved more than his own freedom. And she smiles, sad but certain. It wasn't about being strong, she says softly. It was about knowing what mattered. And for Bumpy, the people always mattered more than the price. The crowd begins to thin as the sun sets over Harlem, casting long shadows across the streets Bumpy Johnson walked for 50 years. Somewhere, a kid who never knew him hears the story for the first time about the man who went to prison rather than betray his community, who chose principle over freedom, who proved that integrity isn't about never falling, but about what you refuse to compromise when the fall comes. And in that moment, in that telling, Bumpy Johnson becomes more than a man with 30 arrests. He becomes the answer to a question the neighborhood has been asking for generations. What does it mean to be strong when strength is the only thing they can't take from you? It means keeping your word. It means protecting what matters. It means understanding that some things, trust, loyalty, community, are worth more than freedom itself. Bumpy never said those words out loud. He didn't have to. He lived them. In jail cells and courtrooms and quiet moments when nobody was watching. He lived them when it was easy and when it was impossible. He lived them until they became inseparable from who he was. And when he died, he left behind something more valuable than power or money or reputation. He left behind proof that a man can be broken by the law without ever being broken by himself. That 30 arrests couldn't touch the one thing that defined him. The rule he never broke, the promise he kept, the trust he honored, even when it cost him everything.